Brilliant. Nice one. Okay, well, a very warm welcome on behalf of the Institute of Cornish Studies and to this this seminar series called Complex Cornwall, Theoretical and Practical Innovations in Interdisciplinary Research. I'm very grateful that we're able to meet here in this room, but also to have people online. And I'm realizing standing here, it's very hard to know where to look because I've got a screen here and I've got you guys there, but the people on the Teams call are over here. So thank you all for joining us. A bit of housekeeping before we get underway. In order for this really to work for those of us on the Teams call and those of us in the room, I'm just going to ask those of you on the Teams call to make sure you keep your microphones muted. And those of us in this room, we've got a microphone down here and it's very good at picking everyone up. If any of us speak over each other, even if you mutter something to your neighbour, it actually sort of jiggles out the audio and the people on the Teams call won't really be able to hear anything. So we just have to try and all work together to accommodate each other. But it's really great that we're able to have this hybrid event today. I'm really thrilled that we're able to have Professor Malcolm Williams here with us. And I'll introduce Malcolm in a moment properly. But this seminar series really came out of thinking about the need for understanding complexity in more detail in the research that we're doing. Increasingly, research is being funded to address real world problems, and that's a good thing. But sometimes there's a challenge for those of us in different disciplines where the complexity of real world problems causes us to butt up against the disciplinary boundaries that we face, and also to really have to think in more complex terms about how that research is going to progress. And that's really the spirit behind this seminar series, and this is the first seminar in that series, that we can actually really explore complexity and how to deal with complexity in a more sophisticated, credible, rigorous way. I realise I've begun and I've not introduced myself properly. My name's Matt Valla and I'm a PhD researcher at Queen's University in Belfast. My research, or part of my research, is on Truro, and so I've sort of fallen in with the Institute for Cornish Studies as part of that research. A couple of notices before I introduce Malcolm. There's a couple of events coming up just to have in the diary. On the 24th of February at 2 p.m. Is the, I think in this room, is the follow-up to Monday's very lively devolution debate, which Jane was involved in. I watched the whole video. I couldn't make the event, unfortunately. I watched the video. It was excellent. There's a follow-up on Cornish democracy, which is hosted by the Institute of Cornish Studies. So you're all very welcome to attend that here. And then on Wednesday, the 29th of March at 3 p.m, we will have Professor Jane Wills, who's here with us, doing the second in this series on Complex Cornwall. And Jane will be speaking on complexity and pragmatism in social and environmental research. So I'm really looking forward to that. Well, the details of seminars after that, we'll let you know. There'll be one in October and then another one in December. So it's a new series that will go on throughout this year. The final thing I wanted to say before I hand over to Malcolm is we're really privileged to actually be joined online by people from all over the world who've had interest in Malcolm's work, don't necessarily have much context for Cornwall or Cornish, or understand why there might be an Institute of Cornish Studies. And so very briefly, I'm going to attempt a brief summary, and you can all judge me as to whether you think it's a good summary or not. My summary would be that Cornwall finds itself in quite a unique position, being a peninsula at the southwest tip of the United Kingdom, but historically speaking, considers England to be a relatively recent invention. And so the long-standing Cornish identity, Cornish culture, including Cornish language, has made for a contested set of identities, both within Cornwall and Cornwall's place within the broader United Kingdom, particularly its relationship with England. And so as we try and figure out what it means for those of us who live here, what Cornishness means, what Cornish identity means, the role of the Cornish language, the impact of history and culture on a future, all those things related to what might be signified by the idea of Cornish is what the Institute of Cornish Studies studies. One of my interests in this, apart from being personally invested because I live in Cornwall, is that I think Cornwall has become a very interesting case study in some of the big global issues that we are faced with around language, identity, globalization, and the intersection of politics, class, migration, and so on and so on. So this is just a plug really for study on Cornwall, and that's what we'll be looking at more throughout this series. I want to introduce Professor Malcolm Williams. Come on up, Malcolm. So Malcolm is the Honorary Professor of Politics here at the Institute of Cornish Studies, and also a Professor at Cardiff University in social science methodology, is that correct?
Social research methods. Yeah.
Social research methods, thank you, yeah. And I just wanted to ask you before I hand over to you, because you're Cornish, you come from St Just, is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right down in the very southwestern tip.
Yeah.
What's your relationship to being Cornish? What does it mean to you, and in terms of being a social science researcher?
Well, okay. I'll try and answer the last bit. The first bit's a bit too complicated for me. I'll try and answer the second bit. I got into researching stuff in Cornwall as a result of being a local councillor many years ago, and there was two issues that the constituents were interested in. One was housing and the other was dog poo. So I didn't really want to make a career in dog poo, so I made a career in kind of housing need research when I became an academic. So most of my research, my empirical research, has been either from a Cornish angle or set in Cornwall. So I spent many years at the University of Plymouth working with Malcolm Brown, who's in the audience today, some of that time, researching in migration, housing, household structure, and so on. And just recently, because I've become part-time at Cardiff, about a year ago, I talked to my colleagues in the Institute, and we decided we would try and set up a social and economic research unit. And that's what I've been doing here for the last sort of 9 months, is setting that up. And we published a couple of reports, one on the state of Cornwall, which you may have seen, and another one on local housing need, local housing affordability right down to postcode level. So I've kind of come back to my roots in terms of research. I'm not sure. I think I grew up in St Just in the 1960s, and you just were Cornish somehow then. You didn't really have to think, why am I Cornish? It just was. But now, Cornishness has become more visible in terms of what we see around us. And so I think the newer generation and old codgers like me have started to look at that anew and to ask ourselves, what does it mean for me to be Cornish now? And it's, I guess when people ask me what my identity is, I will say I'm Cornish by ethnicity, but European by choice. So when you mentioned England, to me that is somewhere I go through when I go to Wales. So I think.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you, Malcolm. Well, look, I'll hand over to you, and we'll have your presentation. Okay. So this is Complexity and Realism in Social Sciences.
Can you start my slides for
me,
please? Yes, I'm a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde character in a way. So my empirical research these days is mostly in Cornwall, about Cornwall, but also the other part of me is that at Cardiff I teach mostly quantitative methods in the social sciences, and much of my career has actually been around methodological issues kind of fairly, some of it fairly esoteric, some of it less so, but around things like probability, objectivity, all of that kind of thing. And many years ago, I came I started to consider myself methodologically as a realist. And over the years, I've been working with other people, and there's a kind of a gang of us now. We would call ourselves the kind of methodological approach that we favour is complex realism. So what I want to do today, and some of the time you'll have to kind of make a bit of a leap of faith, because what I've done today, I've never done before. Many times I've talked about the research I do in Cornwall, and many times I've talked about specific methodological aspects of complex realism, more kind of technical stuff. What I want to do today is to give you an overview of what complex realism is as a way of looking at the social world and as a basis for a methodology. But I want to do that with a very specific work-through example of counter-urbanisation in Cornwall. So I'm going to skip over a lot of the technical detail. So it's a kind of it's a kind of what they might call a $9 tour, really. But I've been more than happy to answer questions afterwards about either the method or the research. Yeah, and can I just say, if anybody wants to interrupt me with a question as I'm going through, if I'm not clear, please do so. So where's my clicker? Okay. So I want to start with the empirical problem, and it's this: counter-urbanisation theory, which is about trying to understand, to describe and understand why people move from more urban areas, not necessarily very urban areas, but more urban areas to more rural ones, what's sometimes called population deconcentration. And the counter-urbanisation theory mostly says that this kind of population deconcentration leads to greater economic prosperity in the destination location. And if you look at a lot of areas in Britain, you look at the southwest region, in fact, that is the case for places like Wiltshire, for Somerset, even to some extent, some parts of Devon. But it has not historically been the case of improved economic performance in Cornwall. In fact, when people move to Cornwall, generally speaking, they're more likely to leave the labour market by 10 years later. We know that from census data. The thing was, back in the 1960s, there was the beginning of a population turnaround where people started to move into Cornwall, but the economy already was as we say, just shot to buggery then. Cornwall Council, from the kind of about, and Malcolm could tell us a bit more detail on that, started to pursue a policy, sometimes informal, sometimes formal, of population-led growth, working on what was possibly a pretty sound principle. If you bring people in who are economically active, they will regenerate the economy. But it didn't work. Poor Cornwall got poorer. So what I want to do is to show you how we research that through a complex realist framework. But first of all, I'm going to hit you with quite a bit of theory about this, but hopefully not too heavy-duty theory. So complex realism, surprisingly enough, brings together the notion of realism and complexity. And realism is a kind of almost an intuitive thing, that not everything we see is all there is. That there is stuff that in the social world that is going on that we can't see. And the old empiricists, the old positivists years ago believed that you could, you could only measure what you could see. They only talked about what you could see, not literally with your eyes, but what you could actually measure with instruments and so on. But realism says there's a truth beyond observation. And the emphasis then becomes on having theories that you can test empirically. So you start off with a particular theory that might be. I mean, we started off with which I'll come to presently, a number of theories which we could show to be wrong as we went on, as we gathered the empirical data. But also, it claims that people have particular properties, dispositional, which are not always realised. And there's a couple of examples there. Let's take for example racism. When I lived in London for a few years, I had a next door neighbour called Doris, and Doris was a lovely woman, and I thought she was a really nice woman until one day she starts using the N-word about some people who lived just three or four doors along. So her racism her powers of racism were being exercised then, but before that they were latent. Yeah, labour power is another one. People may have the power to work, but it doesn't mean that they will work. Yeah, so that's dispositional properties can also be institutions. Institutions have the power to do things, but they don't always do them. So that's a kind of a rough overview of kind of a realist position. And for those of you who are thinking, does this sound like critical realism? Yes, some of it is a bit like critical realism, but it's not critical realism. It's more, this approach is more kind of the realism that we know from the natural sciences rather than the social sciences. Complexity, change is non-linear. We kind of intuitively know that. You know, things are messy out there. When things change, they don't change. So, you know, you can have change which is like very gradual and very sudden. Things suddenly happen. Things kick in and things suddenly. I mean, you know, like the invasion of Ukraine, for example, that kicked in an awful lot of things very quickly. There are emergent properties that, and I'll talk about that in a moment with an example, that things appear that you didn't necessarily expect to appear, that they were there. They were those latent things that, you know, which relate to realism. And its properties are infinite. We can never know, yet alone measure all social properties. Yeah, unlike, you know, the old positivist view of the world where you could grasp everything that you could measure. We know that we can't do that, and partly because the social world changes so rapidly, we can't grasp it all the time. But it is ordered. It's not just mess out there. It's not just noise. We know it's ordered because we wouldn't all be sitting here now doing the things that we're doing. We know what social order is. We do social order the whole time in the university, in our lives. We drive on the left-hand side of the road here, the right-hand side of the road in France. Social order is ordered, and so therefore we can measure it. Its properties, the social world's properties, are contingent, not determined. What happens at one point in time is contingent on what happened in the past, but it's not determined by it. And again, I'm going to give you an example in a minute. And finally, the social life is self-organising, which is, you know, manifestly the case, and we can see that. So that's the kind of theoretical hit in a minute, but I'm going to try and develop it now. So what was real then about the great population growth disaster? So the policy was agreed, I believe, by politicians in the structure plan around 1979. Was it around then when it was in the structure plan?
Yeah, the first one.
Yeah, okay. To encourage people to move to Cornwall to regenerate the economy. The first bit worked. People moved to Cornwall. That was real enough. So you've got a real population flow into Cornwall. Mind you, at the same time, you also got a population flow out of Cornwall because unemployment was extremely high and people were leaving Cornwall at the same time. So this kind of population turnaround. And so between 1971 and 91, over half of the migrants who came in left the labour market, but they remained in Cornwall. There's a wonderful report, well, it wasn't wonderful, it was horrible actually. There was a report produced by McNabb in 1979, which concluded that Cornwall was importing its unemployment. And up until 2000, Cornwall has some of the highest unemployment in Europe. By most measures, Cornwall remains one of the poorest regions of Europe. This was and is the reality. That's the thing we need to try and grasp. And it's complex. It's not simple. And some of the politicians who believe there are simple, straightforward answers are probably wrong. It's much more complex than that. Okay, so that's the reality of it. That's what we're trying to grasp here. So we can theorize this and we can measure it. Now, what do we mean? Some things there, I mean, I've got biological sex, height, weight, but you know, actually, these are not social constructions. We can also measure things like travel to work areas, travel to work and travel to work areas. We can measure where people came from, how long they've been here. We can measure the kinds of work they're doing or did do. So all of those things are measurable. But there are social constructions also, and some of those social constructions are, you know, I'll give you an example. You know, one of the things that when people were moving to Cornwall in that period, and still is the case now, they're very often moving into a tourist landscape. They go to places like Foyce and Ives, Loo, all of those kinds of places. And these are curated landscapes, yeah? They're not Campbell, Druth and Poole. They're not the Clay District. They don't go to those places. They go to the curated ones, which are social constructions, but based on real things. So, and this is the important thing here, when we're talking about this kind of issue of migration and economy and so on, there's a nested complexity here. It's not complicated, it's complex. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Okay, what do you reckon? Two things here, an airliner and a jar of mayonnaise. So what do you reckon? Is the airliner simple, complex, complicated? What do you reckon? You guys behind me can't really participate in this, I suppose. What do people reckon? Complex or complicated?
I'd say complex.
Complex, okay. What about the mayonnaise? Simple, complex, complicated?
I would say complex as well.
Complex as well, okay, yeah. Well, is the social world more like a jet airline than mayonnaise? It's more like mayonnaise. Why? Because mayonnaise, the two basic things in mayonnaise are egg yolks and oil, preferably olive oil, I think, always with mayonnaise. Egg yolks and oil. And from that, you get an emulsion. Now, have you ever tried taking that emulsion apart? I tell you what very often happens is to get the emulsion to come together in the first place. But when you do get it together, I mean, I don't know whether anyone's ever tried taking mayonnaise apart. I mean, why would you? Yeah? But it's very simple, yet it's complex because it's emergent. Yeah? And if you didn't know what mayonnaise was, somebody at one point had a bottle of olive oil and some egg yolks. Now, what possessed them to bring those two together, to beat them together to make mayonnaise, I don't know, but they did. But before that, how would you know you were going to get mayonnaise? Yeah. So those outcomes that we see in Cornwall, those guys in County Hall that were saying, let's bring lots of people in, and we'll regenerate the economy. They thought they were making mayonnaise there, but they didn't. What they made was something completely different. What about the airline? The airliner. Well, I used to make airfix kits when I was young. They were not quite as complicated as the airliner, but airliners are complicated. You could, in theory, take an airliner apart. In fact, they're making I heard on the radio the other morning, they're actually making a fighter plane from the Second World War somewhere up in Kent, actually making it from scratch. So you could take it apart, yeah? So the mayonnaise is simple yet complex, but the airliner is complicated. That's the difference. That's what I'm trying to get over. It's these emergent properties sometimes can be very, very simple, but they are complex. Yes, so mayonnaise requires interaction. It's emergent, as is the social world. Mayonnaise is simple, but complex system, and airlines complicated. So the social world, though, is an infinitely multiple complex system. Infinitely multiple. So, okay. That's a very grand thing to say, and everybody kind of, well, not everybody, people kind of know intuitively what complexity is. You know, we get the idea of we have a feeling for what it is. But we need to be able to do measurement here. And so complex realism has at its heart probability. Now, not just probability in terms of measurement, though that's important, but probability as a reality of a complex social world. So each event raises or lowers the probability of a future event. So I got up this morning and there was a fairly good probability I'd be coming down to Penryn this afternoon. But, you know, things could have gone wrong. The train could have not turned up. You know, I could have had an accident. But as time went on, the probability of my arriving here increased until I came to the room and we hit 1, a probability of 1, an event that happened. And there are some things that have a probability of 0. You can't, you can't travel to the moon unaided, for example, something you just can't do. Now, the social world exists somewhere in that zone between 0 and 1, where the probabilities are intermeshed and changed as a result of what happened before, which increases the probability of something else happening, or decreases the probability of something else happening. And then something else will happen, and it hits that 1, and then that will then go on to change the chances of something else happening. That's pretty theoretical, but actually we can measure these things. Okay, here's a thought experiment. And this comes from a guy, a political scientist called Saperstein. And what you're going to imagine is that we're in a restaurant. My pictures are not necessarily very good ones. I just got, took them off the internet. So imagine there's a restaurant and there's people coming in and they're going to be seated around some round tables, like that. So you've got a number of people seated around the tables. Now, when people come in, they have a wine glass. Imagine you sit down. Now, I'm fairly conventionally right-handed, so I would take the wine. The wine is there. I'll probably be the first one to drink the wine anyway. So I would be the person who would then determine the handedness of the table. I pick up the wine glass. So that means the next person, unless they're going to be incredibly rude around the table, becomes right-handed. Now, let's suppose Matt is left-handed, yeah? And he sits down and he wants to get at the wine first. So he picks up the glass with his left hand. That means everybody else has got to be left-handed around the table. Okay, you with me so far? Right, now this is a thought experiment, right, so it's a bit crazy. So there's the waiters standing there looking pretty bored. There's the waiters, actually don't look bored, do they? There's the waiters and the chef is there as well. We're going to have words with him in a minute, he's the villain. So the waiters are standing there, right, and they say, oh, what should we do today to liven things up? I know, we'll serve the left-handed tables first. Okay, so they serve the left-handed tables first. And let's go back one for a sec. What has happened is the left-handed tables get the portions of food that were left over from lunchtime. And they've been hanging around in the kitchen. They've not been in the fridge, and the old salmonella is in there. So those poor people on the left-handed tables start to eat this food, and 2 or 3 hours later, they're out shouting for Hughie and Eric. Yep, so they're not well. Okay, so let's think about this. Those people coming into the restaurant, so that's where the chef was the villain of the piece. Those people coming into the restaurant couldn't have known, well, they wouldn't have known they're going to get food poisoning at all, but even if somebody had said to them, a proportion of you are going to get food poisoning, you couldn't know which ones are going to get food poisoning. So in a God's eye view, you knew that some were going to, but you couldn't know which ones. So you got something like this. So the diners are seated, say there's 100 of them. And the left-handers served first, that's 50 of them. Right-handers 50. So the food for some is off, 20. Food not off, 30. Poison, not poison, 10. So 10 people get poisoned. But each of those is not determined by that. Yeah, it's only determined by the last thing that happened before. That's the only determination there. So the diners have a 10% chance of being poisoned, But in a complex system, those odds are nested. Yeah, those odds are nested. Now, this is nothing to do with research in Cornwall. This is we did some research. A colleague of mine, Wendy Dyer, and I did some research in Durham on what happens to, and forgive the language here because it's very simplistic, what happens to offenders? Are they classified as mad or bad? Yeah. So bad, they go to prison. Mad, they go to a hospital. Now, what happens to them after that? And we had time-ordered data in which we could calculate those probabilities in that complex, that relatively simple but complex system, yeah, of what happened to them over time. So this is, so that's how we are kind of measuring those kind of probabilities. So that's a thought experiment to give you an idea. This is sometimes, for those of you who are interested, this is what someone's called a Markov chain in statistics. Okay, so what we're trying to do here, and we'll come back to the Cornish example in a minute. Without identifying causes, we can't do social research. No point doing social research if we just describe. We need to answer why questions. So why is it that Cornwall got poorer despite all these economically active migrants coming in to begin with? Why? Well, causes are never simple. They're never push-pull. A simple cause might be, I have these two, in my books, I have these two guys, literally my four guys in this case, these two guys, Denzel and Garfield, right? Denzel hits Garfield, Garfield goes over, yeah? We can observe that cause. Denzel hits Garfield, Garfield falls over. That's a simple, straightforward cause. But that's not the way so we may think we've done that. We may think that, unemployment goes up, and therefore you'd expect people to leave Cornwall who came in before because they've lost their jobs. No, what happened was the environmental attraction of Cornwall kept them there, even though they'd lost their jobs. So those causes are always probabilistic. So, as I said, event A raises or lowers the probability of event B through to Z. Yeah, and it's all then within a kind of this is a probabilistic matrix. I can't remember where this was taken from, but you've got to picture our situation in Cornwall is a little bit like that, with those data points being various things that happened possibly to individuals or institutions over time, through that arrow of time, but within that nested complexity. So back to Earth and Cornwall. Okay, so what we can do, we can refer to these as probabilistic causal mechanisms. And what I'd like to do now, if I might, this won't make sense for a moment, but if you could just pass those back. Sorry, people who are joining us online. You have to bear with me on this one because I can't pass the handouts to the camera.
Try and upload a handout to the chat.
You've got the handout there.
Yeah, so I'll see if I can upload it. I may
not
be able to.
Okay. So what we're trying to do now is to identify some causal mechanisms. What are those kinds of complex mechanisms that are responsible for what happened in Cornwall? Now, lots of people, lots of realists, and the person whose work some of you might know, who is one of my mentors really, is Ray Pawson, and he pretty much popularised the notion of social mechanisms, realist social mechanisms. Mechanisms have been used as a concept of social science for a long while, but Ray's take on it was very close to mine. But where I kind of differ from that is that I think there are mechanisms out there which actually really exist. But because we can't grasp the whole of the social world or the whole of that mechanism at any given time, or even at all, because it always slip away from us and change, it's fluid. I hate the word mechanism, by the way. It always reminds me of like grandfather clocks and stuff, but nobody's come up with a better word yet. But the mechanism is morphing and changing all of the time. It's sort of like the guy showed you that, that kind of that little map of complexity there. So it's changing all of the time, and by the time we measure something, it's changed and moved on to some extent. Although we're taking like slices through time, snapshots and so on. So I think I tend to use the words mechanisms one, which refers to the real mechanisms that exist, but we can't grasp them. They're almost like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And mechanisms two are those which we can theorize and attempt to measure, and try to get as close to mechanism one. So the perfect match would be that, but of course we would never know if we got it. It's like the search for absolute truths about things. We never know when we actually get to that. So what mechanisms could we propose for the failure of the Cornish economy to regenerate? And this is just, and your little handouts will give you a bit more information about those mechanisms. This whole case study is in a fair bit of detail in the book I'll tell you about at the end when I get to the commercial break. So the first one, and the kind of almost the key mechanism, because it goes right back to the 19th century. It's a deep, deep historical mechanism. And it's the economic decline in engineering and mining. And it's the overall context, because it was also where Cornwall started to lose its skills base. It lost its native bourgeoisie. They pretty much created South Australia for a start off. So people were leaving and nothing else was coming in. Although in some ways there were blips. I mean, Bert Biscoe sometimes says Cornwall had a relatively good war, and it did economically. The Second World War was a period of quite, because of the sort of stuff that Cornwall was still making and digging out the ground was very much in demand. It did quite well then. But then after the Second World War, things declined. And I'll tell you a nice measure of this that somebody told me about, which I think is really good. If you went around towns in Devon or Somerset, somewhere like Newton Abbot, say for example, you'll see lots of 1930s and 1950s semi-detached houses. Now, in Cornwall, the number of those kinds of houses that you see built, that had been built then, is very much small. There's a few in Truro, a few in Newquay, a few in Saltash, where I live, but not that many. You don't see hardly any in some towns. And so that was a measure of how little was happening in Cornwall at that time. People were leaving, people were not moving in, and the economy was fairly stagnant. So that's a starting point. Excuse me if I splutter a bit, I'm just getting over a cold. So the second mechanism was the environmental attraction arising from perceptions of Cornwall. And this was well documented in a study by Ron Perry and I can't remember the first name of the man called Dean, who was a second author of the book. Anyway, Perry and Dean in the 1980s did a survey of immigrants in various places, mostly in West Cornwall, looking at why they moved and what their circumstances were and so on. And environmental attraction was very much part of that. And in fact, that's something that we found in every study we've done since then, with the exception of one, which was carried out by Peter Mitchell also in the 1980s. But that was a very special study. Mechanism 4 is an interesting one. And this was one of the first bits of research that we did in the research program right back in the 1990s, was to ask people who had moved to Cornwall what they expected. And I mean, what I'm going to say is something you think, yeah, well, that's probably right. A lot of them thought that there would be opportunities because they'd been to those curated landscapes, those kinds of tourist places, and saw what looked like great prosperity. So I thought, I can do that. Yeah, why not? We'll start a bed and breakfast. We'll start a cafe. One guy who we interviewed in depth interviews we did in the Clay District was really interesting. He was a bit unusual. He said, he said, I was a bricklayer. And they say that, you know, there'll always be a demand for bricklayers. They'll need me when I go to Cornwall. There's always a demand for bricklayers. Because he came here, we built the concrete blocks, breeze blocks, not bricks. So he was out of work because they stopped putting bricks around the top of the chimneys long before that. So he was out of work. And lots of others who came down and started businesses were also out of work. There was a study of Lou, for example, that found most of the businesses that were started up were usually family ones, usually hardly employing anyone from outside of the family, just two or three people, and an awful lot of them went bust. And Cornwall has historically always had very high levels of bankruptcy. Sometimes very hard to disentangle the bankruptcy in Cornwall, because sometimes counted with parts of Devon. So people thought they were going to do well, and they didn't do well. Oh, by the way, I should say also the people that were moving, to kind of head off one myth, the people that were moving were not retired people usually, between 35 and 55, though of course they grew old when they got here and then did retire, but usually between 35 and 55. Then the other really important one is high house prices in the southeast. So what happens is, say using today's prices, you've got a house in London or the southeast and it's worth 900,000. You've got a mortgage of 400,000, or say you've got a mortgage of say 700,000. You could pay off your mortgage, have 200,000 left over, and still just about find somewhere to live in Cornwall. And we know that this is happening because the latest study that we did on affordability at postcode level. No way can locals afford to buy into the Cornish housing market. Impossible. So they're coming from somewhere. People are buying the houses from somewhere, and we know pretty much it's from the southeast, and it's because high house prices in the southeast allow this to happen. An interesting, Peter Mitchell used to, late and great Peter Mitchell, used to measure NHS registrations over time, and these matched absolutely to when house prices in the southeast went down, migration to Cornwall went down. House prices in the southeast go up, migration to Cornwall goes up. So that's a key mechanism. And the comparatively lower house prices in Cornwall. Then there was an interesting one, not a terribly important one, but M7, mechanism 7, was the medium-term government investment. And that was the various schemes that various governments have had to regenerate the economy. And some of them in the 1970s were setting up things called advanced factories. And these advanced factories got a big bung of money. I worked in one actually before I went to university, and it was Fisher Controls in Penzance. They got a big bung of money to open up this factory in Penzance. And then when the money ran out, off they went back up to Leicestershire and to France, leaving the empty building. But still they carried on building these advanced factories, and the joke always used to be that a lot of these advanced factories could be used for building materials to build more advanced factories and keep people employed. That yeah, but the thing about that, and this is something that McNabb picked up on in his report, was that a lot of those people who came stayed. So even when they lost their jobs, and in fact, I know people I worked with at Fisher Controls who had been the key workers that were brought in, are still living in Penzance and around. Mind you, they've gone native now, which is brilliant. They kind of moved in and stayed. And lastly, the one we started with, Cornwall Council's policy of population-led growth, which I think I'm right in saying, the work we did over that time with colleagues in Cornwall Council did kind of show that it ain't working. And you don't hear much about it anymore today. So, how do we know these things? Well, those mechanisms are theoretical but operationalizable. And what happened with those mechanisms I've outlined there is that it isn't as if a whole bunch of us sat down around the table and said, here are these mechanisms, let's research them. What actually happened is we started off with a couple of putative mechanisms. We weren't even calling them that back in the 90s. I don't know what we weren't calling anything particularly. We had a few theories about what was happening. And then what we could do was to build theoretical models with lots of arrows and stuff like that in them to try and show what was happening and then to try and measure those things. So, for example, mechanism one, we can specify, the historic one, we can specify that through population data, labour market statistics and historical documents. Lots of solid evidence there. But of course, you know, as I say, this whole thing about realism, you can't know all of it all of the time. You're never going to do that. What you are doing is getting some pretty good clues to show whether or not your theory was correct or wrong. And probably the most important thing that we did over this time, and I want to try and get back to this very soon with 2021 census data, was that we measured migration and economic change through longitudinally linked census data. What that means is that there's a 1% sample of the census which actually links people, follows them through. This has gone on since 1971. You could now almost follow somebody through the whole lifetime, seeing what's happening to them, seeing whether they. So we could see what were the characteristics of people before they moved to Cornwall, what were the characteristics of the people once they'd arrived in Cornwall, and we could compare those to the people who'd been in Cornwall all along, or the people who had left Cornwall. And that was the first kind of really big project we did. We did a couple like that. And we, as time went on, we concentrated less on the people that left Cornwall because they actually did quite well. They did very well when they left. And in fact, there was, when we published the first report, the Sunday Independent carried this headline which said, "Boffins say get out of Cornwall," which is not quite what we were saying. So that was a really important way of doing this. And then mechanism two, which I can't remember what that one was. About people moving to Cornwall. That was measured both quantitatively and qualitatively by Perry and Dean in their study, but also Peter Mitchell did a really nice study in the 1980s where he went to estates that had been built over the last 10 years to find out who was living there and to find out their circumstances. And a lot of those people who were living on those estates, it wasn't environmental attraction that brought them to Cornwall, it was economic reasons, which is really interesting. So, you know, okay, here's our mechanism where we're saying it's environmental attraction that's bringing people in, but that's modified, that mechanism is modified by a whole lot of people who came actually for economic reasons, probably the people then who were going to work in those kinds of factories and so on that I spoke about. So mechanisms get modified over time, so that you know you get a little bit closer to it than what you were before because you're removing some of the error in it. Mechanism four. Again, I can't remember what that one was, but the study itself was a more qualitative one where we looked at household change, mainly in the Clay District, but also in other areas in mid-Cornwall. And the mechanisms, once we go back to look what M3 and M6 were. M3 life course, and M6, that was a really interesting study that Stuart Burley did in the mid-2000s, and Malcolm was one of his supervisors. And he, one of the interesting things he found is that it wasn't all the same across Cornwall. It was very different in terms of how people were doing, particularly in terms of housing. And back then, there were areas of affordability in terms of housing, Campbell and Pulbridge Roof, for example. That's not the case anymore, but there were then. But there was this also, something else he identified, which I thought was fascinating, and continues to be fascinating, what he called the Carrick effect, where the Carrick district, you might say the corridor from Truro down to Falmouth, was very different to other parts of Cornwall. It was in the sense that you're much more likely to get educated middle-class people there. That's probably true with knobs on now because of the university. So it was, and of course it was one bit of Cornwall didn't vote to leave the EU. And it's also the area of Cornwall now that has the most regrets over leaving the EU, that particular constituency. So, so that was quite interesting. So, where are we? Yeah, M6. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So, okay, how do we do these things? I've told you about each of these studies. Much of it was theoretically modelled. So, as I said, the arrows on the piece of paper or on the screen, trying to show how these things might have changed, and perhaps, and also using sometimes using Bayesian probability to try and show how these things might change in concert. That didn't go very far because he was using, I think, a statistical hammer to crack a nutshell. We didn't go too far with that. One of the other methods that can be used is based on single case probabilities, where you follow individuals through time and look at their. When I told you about the Durham prison study, that kind of thing. So what you've got basically is a whole lot of different kinds of methods to measure and to understand what's going on. And then you can look at them in concert to see how they actually mesh together and how you can propose those causal arrows, if you like, about what's changing what, when, and for who, and for how long. So that's how we did it. So I think now it's just a little recap, a little theoretical recap. So these mechanisms are dispositional. They have the potential to cause things, but the properties may not be actualized. So there may be latent things there that haven't happened, didn't happen. Now, of course, that's not necessarily a pessimistic picture. It also means when we are looking at Cornwall now, and I think my feeling is we're looking through a slightly more optimistic lens, and I think the devolution debate on Monday kind of showed that, whichever side you're on in that, it kind of showed we're looking through things a little more optimistically. So there are things there that are mechanisms that have not yet fired. I mean, Joni, for example, Joni Willett talks about the clothing industry in Cornwall. Little known how important it is, but it is important. So these kinds of things can actually make a difference to other mechanisms. And of course, obviously things like geothermal power, possibly a revival of mining, but that might be a mechanism that doesn't fire. We don't know. So they're ordered, they're fluid, and the social world changes constantly, but there is order in that change, and that's what we're trying to measure, often imperfectly. And the properties of the mechanisms are contingent, they're not determined. You know, think back to my example of the restaurants. You know, you can't always. This is why sometimes forecasting can go so horribly wrong, because the world is complex, and one slight change can make an awful difference later on. And so you can't expect that kind of linear change to carry on occurring. You might get these kind of islands of stability where things do look much the same over time, and then something happens and then they don't. I mean, another non-Cornish example of that, which I've used in the book, is the guy, Mohamed Bouazizi or something his name was. He set himself on fire in a market in Tunisia back in the 2000s, and he started a whole revolution across North Africa, just that one event. Yeah, but the event that led to him setting himself under the fruit cellar, led him to set himself on fire, was a whole complex series of nested mechanisms beforehand to do with a repressive government in Tunisia, to do with the price of fruit and vegetables, all of those kinds of things. He sets himself on fire, and then we can follow those complex, changing mechanisms all through to the Syria and the Civil War, and even right through to now, the terrible earthquake today, where Syria is in a much worse position than Turkey is. So, you know, it's about sometimes grasping that historical context, but zooming in and measuring the bits to try and capture that kind of change to show what the mechanisms are. Okay, so this is the advert, commercial break. This is all including the much more detailed work through case study and some other things as well, in a book I published a couple of years ago called Realism and Complexity in Social Science. So you may want to have a little look at that. I think that, how have I done for time? Have I done all right?
You've done all right. We've got half an hour left.
All right,
so
okay.
I think it would be, there's quite a few questions come up on the chat.
No problem.
And it would be great to, I think,
okay,
on this issue, on housing particularly, so maybe it'd be good just to stick with that.
Yeah, sure. What I was going to do was, I was going to ask you, some audience participation, but we may not have any time for that. But, you know, the takeaway, if we don't do that, might be, you know, what other kind of complex mechanisms can we think of? Because I would actually genuinely like to try to understand how some of those other mechanisms are meshing with the ones I've perhaps talked about today. So, you know, yeah. So, yeah, take a question.
Brilliant. First of all, thank you very much, Malcolm. Just going to end this, and then can back in. Okay. So there's quite a few questions on the chat. There's lots of engagement. Okay. So quite a few people. I suppose one of the themes was just about the housing issues specifically. So just a comment first of all. So Becky Heron, who's with us from the University of Lincoln, says she recognises some of these mechanisms at play in Lincolnshire. And it's interesting to see the similarities and differences with another rural area. Kenza Broadhurst was asking, where does the issue of Cornwall Council providing social housing for overspill from London or Manchester or wherever factor into that kind of mechanism?
It was what you mean now or in the past? Did you say that historically it was quite small? That Bodmin was the only town where there was overspill.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that wasn't specified in Kenza's question. Maybe Kenza, if you want to add anything on that. But so your point is you don't think it's a big factor? No. I mean, the other thing I don't think is quite really big emotive thing, of course, in Cornwall is holiday homes. But actually, it's very visible, very, very visible in some towns and villages. But the biggest problem is affordability in the housing market generally. Right.
Off piece there.
So, but don't you think that holiday homes are affecting the price of housing? I mean, this is connected.
It is connected, and they do affect the price of housing. But what's affecting the price of housing has and always has done is the ability of people in other parts of the country, particularly the southeast, to buy into the Cornish housing market. And let me say that I would hypothesise if we didn't have a single holiday home in Cornwall tomorrow, and we might find this out if the council votes to increase charges on holiday homes, but I would hypothesise if we didn't have a single holiday home tomorrow in Cornwall, we would still have a massive housing problem. It'd still be there.
Yeah, so if we repossessed all the holiday homes and used them for social housing, we wouldn't have enough, is what you're saying.
That's a different. That you see now. This is a trap I'm not going to fall into, because that's precisely what I mean about those unknown consequences of complexity. I don't know is the answer to that.
Yeah,
I really don't know. Can I take a question?
I just want to add a follow-up comment from Kenza, who's just saying your response is interesting because the perception from somewhere like Camborne, where she lives, was that Cornish people were missing out on social housing due to Cornwall Council selling out to Greater London Council. So it sounds
I
like
mean, do you think that's a big problem, Malcolm? I don't think it's massive.
I think it's a myth, actually.
Yeah.
You know, because as well as working for the council, I have been a local politician, and when you go around knocking on people's doors, there is this story that that the housing associations are doing deals with councils up country to sell them blocks of houses, and there's just no evidence.
I know where this came from in my own hometown of St Just. They built a small social housing development, and a couple of houses were taken by people from, I'm not sure, I think they said Liverpool or something, but I think these were people who really needed somewhere to live. You know, this was like emergency, like a real emergency. It was not some sort of deal they'd done with Liverpool Council or anything.
Okay, let's go to the question over here.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt that. I'm going to ask you something different slide.
Would you be okay to speak up a little bit?
Yeah,
Just
sorry,
the mic.
okay.
Thanks.
I was just going to ask you, I mean, how much do you think supermarkets have played in this? Because with the incoming of supermarkets and the shutting down of local small businesses and things like that, they've actually taken away full-time permanent jobs. People that lose full-time permanent jobs can't apply for mortgages, therefore have no chance of even trying to purchase a home. And also supermarkets have cut the prices of the goods that these people, that the farmers, the fishermen would have been able to have acquired in the past. And I don't know where I was going with this one, but basically a lot of people are leaving because they can't get the work, they can't get the full-time hours, they're on 0 hours or they're on seasonal hours. People of my generation left in the 70s and have come home. Now our children have gone.
Yeah.
Mainly the males, and I can't see them coming back. They're travelling abroad again.
I think I would say two things there. The first one is I think what you've done is proposed another possible mechanism we might want to explore. To what difference does the supermarket? I mean, I think as a citizen I might want to speculate, but as a social scientist I wouldn't. I'd want to give some hard evidence that what's happened, how it's happened, and what the context is. But the second thing about leaving is that, you know, again, reasons to be cheerful. We've got this wonderful university campus here now. Kids who had to go. I mean, my view has always been if somebody wants to go up country and go away, fine. But if they don't want to and they want to stay here, they need to have the opportunity. And this has given that opportunity. I think it's brilliant.
Let me bring in some more questions from the chat here. We've got lots of things being put. It's excellent. So there's a question here that says, which is it's a question in two parts or two linked questions from Amy Hale. So first, was there a segment of incomers who were just less likely to be economically robust? And can you identify populations that were more culturally inclined to kind of drop out and see Cornwall as a good place to go and do that? And related to that is, were there sort of anti-materialist values driving particular populations in making the move in ways that caused them not to participate in or develop the economies in the places they landed? And so it's interesting. I think it's an interesting question because it's quite a complex question. And the final line of that: what, if any, intersection is there between that phenomenon with the development of, say, like the art and the culture section historically?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. That's a really good. Well, there's lots and lots of questions there, most of which I'm afraid that I can't answer. One of the intriguing things about the study that Peter Mitchell did of the new estates, one of the aims was to find out how many people who moved into those houses were unemployed, because there was a concern that would probably, I think, talking to Peter about that, because I was always intrigued to know why that was asked. And there was this concern that people were moving to Cornwall to get unemployed, as it were, and they were moving for environmental reasons. Now, I think some of the more later qualitative stuff, some of the work that a woman called Carol Williams did back in the 90s, early 1990s, she was looking specifically at housing. But there was a good segment of people then who were moving, who moved for lifestyle reasons, and were let's say kind of like perhaps in the arts sector. Now some of those did incredibly well, and continued a grand tradition of the arts in Cornwall. But some of them were more artistically inclined and talented. And kind of did create this kind of perhaps a subculture, but we never really got at that. Again, that's another mechanism that we might want to look at. Something I think could only probably be researched qualitatively, though. Most of what we did was quantitative.
I want to move the line of questioning a little bit away from just specifically on the housing details. To the sort of methodological considerations.
Sure. Yeah.
So we have a question on here. We're joined by Cobus Murray, who's a professor of translation studies from University of Free State in Bloemfontein in South Africa, and has written a lot on complexity and translation. And so he's saying, I found your ideas about propensities really powerful as a way of introducing a soft causality and a complex causality.
Yes.
He's wondering if you could comment a bit more on that. And for instance, do you think it can be used both qualitatively and quantitatively? And he also comments, it seems closely related to Stuart Kaufman's ideas about biological evolution as not being caused, but being made possible.
Yes.
And did you create this idea for the aims of a softer causality, or did you have something else in mind?
I remember reading Kaufman's work many years ago, and he probably, sadly, I didn't acknowledge his work in that book or the previous one, but I think he may have been a sort of little influence at the back of my mind. Qualitatively, I don't think you can. I think you can talk about propensities in a soft sense. See, I've always believed that in qualitative research, you're looking at the angle I come from. You're looking at social stability and what disturbs that social stability. And linguistically, that's quite interesting about what changes how people use language. And we're seeing this in Cornwall now, how the Cornish language is starting to get a great deal of legitimacy. How do those things kind of happen? What's the propensity for the Cornish language to do that? When I'm talking about propensities, though, so in other words, I agree that you can use it in that kind of softer qualitative sense. But when I've talked about propensity, mostly when I've been talking about it in the book, I've actually been talking about statistical propensity that's measurable. But that's actually quite difficult because there's our traditional methods of measuring in statistics. I'm trying to be careful not to get too technical here. Use the frequency interpretation and probability. So they are just about measurement. But what we're suggesting here with the propensity interpretation is that those probabilities lie within single points of change or single cases. And so the first one is epistemological and the second one is ontological. So to finally answer that completely is that I think you can start with the qualitative, and then if you've got something that you can actually measure the propensity, then you can move to the quantitative.
Okay, interesting. So it becomes like a baseline to build from.
Yes.
Okay. Do we have other questions here in the room about the methodological approach that Malcolm's outlined?
Yeah, you mentioned something about a Durham study that followed the lives of individuals.
Yeah.
Was that an ethnographic study?
No, it wasn't ethnographic.
Yeah.
What it was doing, it was using prison data and care data to look at particular time points, what happened. And so if you can imagine, here we are, you've got, let's just say just two people, person A, person B. Person A is told that they're bad and they're going to go to prison. So what happens to them in that trajectory? Person B is told you're ill, you're going to go to hospital. What happens? And what was the previous trajectories into that? But you can only do this when you've got time-ordered data, and specific measurement points. So it's to do this, and this is using single case probabilities, a propensity interpretation. You can only do it with those kinds of data.
Yeah.
Yeah, it will only work with those.
I'm working with a lot of memoirs at the moment of people in Newman Mousel from the mid-19th century, wondering about sort of integrating some of what you're talking about.
Yes. What you could do, I'll tell you an idea. Now, I'm no linguist, so please forgive me if I'm talking rubbish here, but if you've got the transcripts of that kind of stuff, you could look for those keywords at time points and see whether they're connected with other things and what the probability is of those being connected with those other things. I don't know if that's rubbish or not, but that's, for a layperson in that kind of area, that's the way I would approach it, using single case probabilities.
Yeah, thanks.
The question I have, Malcolm, about this sort of general methodology, you had the kind of map of all the different data points in this cloud. Yeah. And so to what extent does actually doing research this way require a massive collaborative effort? Because unless you've got loads of people working on tracing all of these different lines of possible causality to then get enough data in this direction and that direction over time periods, and then you do your analysis and then you follow causal chains. I mean, does it have to be a huge effort then to make it work?
No. What I was talking about was a whole series of research projects done by different people over time. I was not even involved with some of them. So what you're doing is looking at it's almost like a meta-analysis. Now, you don't have to have that. You could have, let's take a supermarket example. Suppose that we wanted to find out what different supermarkets make. Well, you could straight away look at how, how much value added supermarkets put into the economy. You could look at their pay rates. You could do an examination of the supermarket economy, if you like, and then that would suggest possibly a mechanism, how it fits in with the rest of. Because in some ways we need a lot more research in Cornwall, but I would say that, wouldn't I? But on the other hand, we've actually got a lot of research in Cornwall that's been done by people like Malcolm over the years, and Peter Mitchell before. So we've got a lot of good data out there. But there's usually other data anyway. If you're in Lincolnshire, for example, you're going to find some data you can use to build your theoretical model for a specific intervention.
So would you like to see more analysis done of existing data using this approach? Yes,
revisit the data. Some of it now is, I mean, the thing is, it's important to do these things because we have short memories, both academics and policymakers in Cornwall. We have short memories. We keep reinventing the wheel. A lot of when I've talked to people now who are policy officers in Cornwall Council, and some have got no idea of that work that has been done then. Yeah.
Okay, we've got two questions. I'll go to three, in fact. I'll go to Jane first.
I've been thinking about causation while you were talking, Malcolm, and this is one of the big challenges for social science because you can never really pin down causation. It's very difficult to. A causes B. So you've got this notion of probabilities, and then you've got this notion of mechanisms, and you're trying to kind of get at that question.
Yes.
But a lot of the time, what we're doing really is looking at correlation, not causation. We're saying, this affects that. It's a correlation. It's very difficult to say it's a causation. And in some ways, you could argue that your whole premise is based on this correlation between population movements in migration, out migration, and poverty. You've made lots of statements about Cornwall was poor because the people who moved in didn't carry on working and they were later unemployed. But you've made a whole ton of assumptions there that the reason why Cornwall was poor was because people moved in or people moved out. It was a whole load of other reasons as well. Migration might not have caused anything to do.
Well, it might not.
Okay.
Sorry.
Because what I'm trying to get you to do is sort of pick up the complexity theory end of things, maybe more than the realism thing, because you're kind of making it quite complicated for yourself by saying, you know, we've got to identify these mechanisms, then we've got to find out which one what their probabilistic tendencies are, which you could do stats to look at this and look at correlations. And then you're trying to say that this causes that. Whereas if you actually go to your complexity theory, which got a bit lost here, you've got all those lovely things about things being non-linear, they're emergent. And from my point of view as a geographer, you'd start in place and you'd use that more, which Joni, of course, Joni should chip in here because this is what her book's done, is to start from place and look at the complexities of relationships in place and see what is emergent from it. You might not use the language of causation. You'd use your mayonnaise kind of analogy much more. Things are messy and you need to start with place and what's actually going on in that place. So St Austell is going to be different from Falmouth. It's going to be different. So as you get down the spatial scales as well, you see more of the complexity than if you would at the Cornwall scale. So we need a kind of place-based complexity theory thing, which is also scalar in sophistication, so that you can also be relational. So you can say what's happening in Australia in the tin market is affecting what's happening here. So there's a kind of spatial relationality about all this as well. You need to be much more on the complex end, I think, than the realism.
Okay, in my defence, I did say at the beginning of this I was going to be skating over this fairly lightly. I think in the book, I think there's a lot more detail there. Yes, I think you're right. I mean, the old positivists believed that you know, you could only have correlation, but they weren't prepared to theorize from that what the causes might be. All of these things are...
They made lots of assumptions.
They made lots of assumptions and they pretended they didn't a lot of the time. But I don't think we're making assumptions here. I think it's something else I talked about in the book, is the notion of inference to the best explanation. What we've got, does that actually suggest X or Y? Yeah, and if it suggests Y, then we must test that to see if that's the case. The other thing I would say about complexity and about coming down to a micro level, and again, I've got another example from Thailand in the book about going down to that micro level with sex workers and so on. Yes, of course. But you can't, the point is, if you're trying to build a mechanism, you cannot grasp all of it at the same time. You can't do that. So all we end up doing is say, well, this is really complex and we can't do anything about it. You've got to, at some point, you've got to actually nail your colours to the mast and try and do some measurement. Because if you don't do that, you know, you're not going to ever have explanations that you can test. And the final thing I would say about causality, and particularly this approach, is that if you're using longitudinal data, that's probably one of the best ways to capture causality. A non-Cornish example, some research I did with some colleagues, was to look at people over time that answered the question in the census about whether they had limited long-term illness. Yeah. So if people at say 1991 said they got limited long-term illness and then in 2001 still got that or had not, we can look at those kinds of things that are associated with that. But we know that they're the same people. Yeah, so you can actually measure that change over time. Causation is always going to be a kind of a holy grail. All we can do is to try and bring together the most likely explanations and try and measure them and try and falsify them even to show if they're wrong. So I'm kind of agreeing with you, but kind of not. Yeah.
It's really complicated.
It is. Well, it's complex.
Let's go to the discussion at the back.
Well, if I was going to pick up on the Jane's use of the word complicated in the context, because we never did clarify why the airliner was complicated or complex.
Oh, I did.
But
I did, because an airliner's not. Yeah.
But so that makes it complicated.
It's complicated.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's like a giant airfix kit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And remake it.
Yeah.
is
But
what
my
I'm saying.
question is, it's probably going after the same fox that Jane was, but it's your complexity approach has been about the mechanisms of causality, not about the definition of the problem. So today we've just talked about the problem was quite reductive. It hung off the McNabb 79 assessment that Cornwall's.
No, it didn't. No, that was just part of that. Was just something I mentioned on the way.
The problem you framed was it failed.
Yeah.
Right. So the problem's really simple, and I guess when I'm coming a bit like Jay, I'm saying actually the problems. I'm not saying that's untrue, but it's confined to the parameters of GVA-based assessments of growth. Right. That's where that assessment of failure comes from. So I'm just interested in how we might come at it. So where you've teased out the different M1 through M7 or M8, I think I'm here because of the combination of M2 and M3. How you tease that out from the mechanism side, I wonder if we could, I've got a little diagram here where the problems, instead of just being a clear circle, it's kind of got lunar phases off it because there's actually these blurry edges of the problem, these different aspects of growth. If you refine the parameters of what we mean by failed growth as a problem, and I'm just comment on.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you would. I mean, you could have gone in at various different mechanisms and started from different ones there, yeah. But that was the one I picked on because it was a nice, simple one. I would be the first to say that that was. I think it failed not just simply because of economic growth. Yeah, it failed in other respects because it increased. Well, again, actually, McNabb did actually measure that. It increased unemployment. Yeah, so there were specific things other than economic growth you could measure as a result of that. I mean, you could go around saying, well, as Jane has possibly said, well, how do you know this? It might have been other things. Well, yeah, of course it might have been, but what we have to do is infer to the best explanation and test that explanation. Because we can't grasp everything all of the time. And, okay, my challenge would be, show me that Cornwall did do better. Yeah, show me that it did.
Well, it's done better for some people, that's the thing. So it's this tension ongoing that I'm interested in.
Sure, yeah.
Regeneration and gentrification, because quite often they look like the same thing, they're just felt differently by different groups of people.
Yes, that's true. And you might say, okay, well, some of the immigrants did extremely well. But then if you look, another study I didn't talk about was one done by Philippa Aldis. If you look at then what happens to the sons and daughters of the immigrants, they don't do terribly well very often. Yeah, so generationally, they become downwardly mobile. So not all of them, because some of them have got social capital because they've still got family in other parts of the country. Yeah, so that means that they have that social capital to move away again. And interestingly, in Philippa's study, one of the things which was absolutely fascinating was that for like 150 years, people always believed that it was Cornish people who were leaving Cornwall, and that was absolutely true. Then there was a kind of we don't know when it happened, but at some point that started to change. The people who were more likely to leave were the sons and daughters of the immigrants, which I thought was really interesting. And we could hypothesize, we might be wrong, but we hypothesized from that is that before those Cornish people who were leaving had the skills base that was in demand elsewhere, mining, engineering skills, farming skills, whatever. But because a lot of those people have already left, the people who might have the skills now are the ones with the social capital, who are the sons and daughters of the immigrants. Not all of them, because some of them become poor. Sorry, I went off on
it. So would you not? I don't know why you said it's possible to ask this, but
so what?
No, it's just a reflection. But my question would be: would you not? Why is Cornwall's innate feudalism and limits to social mobility?
Innate feudalism? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that's the whole. I mean, the symptom would be the fact that the vast majority of productive land has been owned by the same 5 families for 1,000 years. The embeddedness of establishments in Cornwall. It's a wider topic, right? But I mean,
yeah. I mean, that might be something else to explore.
but it's Cornwall's culture of being the duchy and proud of it, as in being we're very much subjects here rather than perhaps citizens that you might have in another region. I'm treading on some actually provocative ground, but I think that I would see that, well, certainly as a Cornishman returning, I've been back 12 years, I observe in a way that I wouldn't have done if I'd stayed here the whole time, just how the self-oppression and subservience of a lot of people here.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't want to comment on that. It's getting well out of my comfort zone in terms of research. Yeah.
They are Cornish families, Spire families. They've been in that. It's been hundreds of years like that. And if you look at the history of the British state, with lots of Cornish gentry, very central to the evolution of the British state.
Cornish on Waterloo.
Well, that's the only thing I would say. I'm not sure that makes too much difference to house prices in Cornwall at the moment.
That's strange.
Yeah, it's the complexity of the situation, the place-based.
I'm going to come to a final question, and because we're pretty much at time, we've been waiting a while.
It's just another angle to look at things, and what we're looking at as a people down here anyway, is that it's not just the holiday lets and the Airbnbs, who are more than likely owned by people who are absent landlords.
Yeah.
The money taken from the proceeds taken from these businesses goes straight out of Cornwall, it's not reinvested.
Yeah.
Same thing happens with big supermarkets. They'll take money from Cornwall, it'll go up to the central offices, it's not reinvested within the community. And with all the effect of the supermarkets taking on things like clothing, like goods and things like that, and therefore creating an unfair disadvantage or unfair market for local establishments to sort of fight against. All the time money's going out of Cornwall, nothing's being reinvested, and therefore our councils are suffering now because they haven't got the businesses to get their rates from. So in a way we're ripe for picking, aren't we? We're ripe for being marginalised by our government and being forced into a position of taking on things like a mayor when we don't want one, because they know that we're in such a state, such a difficult position, we can't argue against it at all. All the time we feel as if the people are being oppressed. There's a lack of dignity now. There's a whole different feeling about being Cornish in Cornwall. You don't feel at all respected. I think that's another angle to the.
I think there's a lot of optimism with younger people as well.
The ones that are here still, possibly, yes.
Yeah, fair enough.
There's a couple of hands went up in reaction to that. Christy and then Jane.
Mine was more just to sort of add to ask if anybody knows of any data on second home ownership, whether they're owned by Cornish people or by people outside of Cornwall. Because I find more and more when I'm knocking on the doors of second homes and getting in touch with the owners, they actually live in the village next door.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think it's more complicated. This is where I do think complexity helps. Yeah, I mean, it would be a great thing to look at properly, but who's selling the properties to the incomers from the south east? It's Cornish people. Cornish people.
I think that. No, I'm not sick, but I think we're starting to get into territories of myths and legends.
All right. I'm going to call a close because we've just passed time. Really appreciated this discussion. Thank you so much, Malcolm, for everything you presented and for handling all of these questions so well. A big round of applause. And you've raised really fascinating methodological questions for us, as well as some specific questions that we've been dealing with. If I can ask you just to hold off, just because you'll affect the audio for the online participants. In the coming seminars in this series, the next one, in case you missed it, 29th of March with Professor Jane Wills, we'll be looking at complexity and pragmatism in relation to social and environmental research. Then we have a break while all of the summer and exams and whatnot go on, and we'll be back in October with Professor Stefan Bohm, who will be looking at complexity in relation to business practices and organisational dynamics. And then finally, in December, we will be hearing from Dr. Joni Willett, who is the co-director of the Institute for Cornish Studies, is here with us, but is currently in Virginia on a Fulbright scholarship, so doing her research. But she'll be back and she'll be talking about complexity in relation to adaptive regional assemblages and the work that she's done in her book. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of this series, and I really hope that you will all. I realise I'm not on the camera here. Sorry, guys online. I'm really hoping you'll all come back and follow up and continue these conversations, because they're really fascinating conversations to have. One little plea before you go. I've posted a little form on the chat. If you're on the Teams call, please could you give us some feedback, help us know how we can improve this. I've got some paper forms here and some pens. If you are happy to just give us some feedback before you go, it'll just help us improve any aspects for the coming seminars. Really appreciate it.
Are you, for this and the other seminars, are you making the slides available?
Yeah, if you're happy.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
So the recording will go, we'll start to just bank some of these. I think they'll go on the Institute of Cornish Studies website. Just need to work out some of the technical aspects of where they go, but I want to be able to curate a conversation as we go so that we can keep coming back, because I think some of these same themes will keep popping up. But we've had participants today from Virginia with Joni. We had someone from New York University. We've had people from South Africa. We had someone in from Brazil. So we've had people, and of course all around the UK. So it's been great to have such a diverse audience in this seminar. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.